Hello everyone, my name is Timo Uotinen. It's my pleasure to join you there at the University of Anbar in Iraq. Many thanks to Dr. Majid Mohammed Midin for inviting me, and also thanks to everyone for sending me great questions, which I'll try to answer during this lecture. And apologies for any and all mispronunciations. The title of my lecture is What Are You? What Would You? Twelfth Night, Identity and Desire. Or rather, Twelfth Night, Identity, Desire and Love. What countryman? What name? What parentage? These are the questions Sebastian poses to his doppelganger, Viola, disguised as Cesario. Antonio wonders, how have you made division of yourself? An apple cleft in two is not more twin than these two creatures. Which is Sebastian? Even Sebastian is unsure of this uncanny meeting. Do I stand there? He asks, being unsure of his identity. The grounding questions of what countryman, what name, what parentage establish our identity, who we are. We would ask the same things today. Where are you from? What's your name? What's your last name? Even as Viola gives the right answers, one point remains inconsistent. Were you a woman, as the rest goes even, I should my tears let fall upon your cheek and say, thrice welcome, drowned Viola. To help things go even, Viola offers more information. A mole on their father's brow, her age when their father died. The final piece to make things cohere is her clothes, her maiden weeds. This identity check is about making things go even, to have the facts agree, to be in accordance with each other. The same logic still applies today in online security questions, making sure that the personal information of the current user is in accordance with the original user. Here, identity is effectively a list similar to the one Olivia provides in Act 1, Scene 5. Item, 2 lips, indifferent red. Item, 2 grey eyes with lids to them. Item, 1 neck, 1 chin, and so forth. Olivia's 2 grey eyes would now, of course, be full of biometric data needed in modern passports. On a philological side note, the word item used by Olivia, which is Latin and means just so or in like manner, shares an etymology with identity, in the Latin identitas, quality of being the same, which in turn derives from idem, meaning same. We usually speak of identity, when we usually speak of identity, we are talking the defining content. We're talking of the defining content of our self, of the self. What makes us who we are. In literary studies, this is usually talked about through the 4 topics of gender, race, class, and sexuality. But there are, of course, many more markers of identity, like ability, religion, consumption patterns, geography, tribal affiliations, political stances, cultural backgrounds, and so on. Moreover, these topics and markers are quite often connected to each other, and when we discuss those linkages, we are taking an intersectional approach. The term intersectionality, of course, where these identifying things intersect, like roads at a junction, was coined by the American scholar and philosopher Kimberly Crenshaw. Although I will be touching on identity somewhat in these terms, my main interest is slightly different. Namely, how do the individual characters identify themselves in relation to each other and the play? My leading question comes from Olivia. What are you? What would you? Here, identity is linked to desire. This connects to the latter part of the play's title, What You Will. Especially in early modern parlance, will denotes desire. So as the title would be Twelfth Night, or What You Desire, the guiding theme of the play, in my reading, is desire instead of love. Moreover, if it is desire that is the central motivating factor for the main characters and at the root of their identity. What are you? What would you? If the latter question is about desire and wanting to do something, the former seeks identity. However, it is not who are you, but what are you? This what seeks to know only to categorize. In asking these questions, Olivia is intrigued by Cesario Viola, but is unsure because he does not conform to her expectations. As Sebastian before, everything about Cesario Viola does not go even. This cognitive operation that is stunted in Olivia is what the 20th century German critical theorist Theodor W. Adorno calls identity thinking. Adorno explains, identity thinking says what something falls under, of what it is an exemplar, and therefore what it itself is not. End quote. Ozrach Silberbusch offers a good clarification on this and is worth quoting at length. Quote, identity thinking is as old as reason. We are all identity thinkers, inescapably. Our mind needs a framework into which to channel the innumerable phenomena that assail our senses at any given moment. We subsume in order to make the overwhelming richness of the universe more graspable. When we see a tree, our mind immediately identifies the object in question as a tree, a specimen of the category trees, which allows us to link the identified object to a certain number of characteristics associated with trees that we can then filter according to our needs at that particular moment. Trees give shade, trees have branches that we can use as firewood, some trees bear fruit, etc. Or we can further identify the tree as a particular kind of tree, a member of the subcategory fruit trees or pine trees. Most of this identification happens unconsciously unless we make a particular effort to name the species of tree we are looking at. End quote. Cesario disrupts Olivia's identity thinking, which explains why she has some questions when they first meet in Act 1, Scene 5. What kind of man is he? What manner of man? Of what personage and years is he? Whence came you, sir? Are you a comedian? What are you? What would you? Why, what would you? What is your parentage? Identity thinking is also perhaps why Cesario and Sebastian are misidentified. The human mind has a tendency to over-rely on the categorizing network that is already in place. We look for, favor, recall, and interpret information in a way that it confirms beliefs and ideas we already have. This is called confirmation bias. This is why when Feste refuses to believe that Sebastian is not Cesario, his incredulity is mocking. No, I do not know you, nor I am not sent by you by my lady to bid you come speak with her, nor your name is not Master Cesario, nor this is not my nose either. Nothing that is so is so. The misidentified Sebastian radically confounds Feste's perception. He cannot trust his nose, nor how the world appears in front of him. Nothing that is so is so. Identity in this sense is a part of perception. Therefore, when I propose to identify the title of the play with desire, the question arises, how does desire affect identity in the play? Before we continue with this line of thinking, let's consider the play and its author. So what do we mean when we say Shakespeare? What countryman? What name? What parentage? I suggest there are three distinct meanings to that identity. The historical person, the cultural icon, and the body of work that bears his name. The historical William Shakespeare was the son of a glover born in Stratford-upon-Avon, Warwickshire, in 1564. We know very little about him by modern standards, but by the standards of his day, we know very much. However, we have no way of knowing, as Heba asks, his intention when writing Twelfth Night, as no records exist of his thought processes, no journals, letters, or other communications. Even of his works, no manuscripts survive, with the exception of 4 handwritten pages, which are his contribution to the play Sir Thomas More. Therefore, most answers to questions about Shakespeare's thoughts are just conjecture. Having said that, my thoughts on his intention regarding Twelfth Night is that on one hand, he wanted an enjoyable play that would help him make a living as the playwright and actor for the theatre company he was a part of. On the other hand, he would have the right person. He would be the right person to write this play, because he himself was the father of a set of boy and girl twins, Hamnet and Judith. Hamnet died in 1596, and it's thought that Hamlet, to an extent, memorializes his son. As Hamlet was written probably just before Twelfth Night, so perhaps that event has influenced this play also. Although Shakespeare was famous in his lifetime and remained popular when somewhat popular after his death, his cultural influence was very different to what it is now. It was with the British Empire that Shakespeare got exported around the world, and it is perhaps to the credit of his works that Shakespeare stayed around after the empire went away. A side note on cultural influence is that the first tragedy written in my native Finnish language was an adaptation of Macbeth. Shakespeare's popularity hit new heights during the Victorian period as he became idolized. These new heights can also be partly attributed to the Romantic period and its conception of the artistic genius that still persists today. The third identity that bears his name, what parentage, of Shakespeare is that of his works. However, the process of how his plays came into this world is a bit more complex than a poet going away, writing in solitude, and coming back with a ready text. As the Shakespeare critic and editor Gary Taylor explains, quote, "We mislead ourselves if we imagine a play moving from text to stage, as though textuality and theatricality were separate entities, as though one evolved into the other. For Shakespeare, a play began life in the theatre." End quote. The play texts arise from this collaborative environment. As the manuscripts were written for colleagues, they often lacked stage directions and other information like clothing or which song is to be sung and by whom, because the professionals reading those texts were expected to know these things. Shakespeare also wrote to specific people, as Gary Taylor notes. The lead actor of the company, Richard Burbage, had an exceptionally good memory, so he could remember the long lines of Hamlet and other substantially demanding parts. The lead roles also aged with Burbage from the energetic Henry V, early in Shakespeare's writing career, to the old cantankerous King Lear later on. Changes in what the acting company's personnel can also be seen in the roles, as the company's first clown, Will Kemp, who was known for his raucous roles of Dogberry in Much Ado About Nothing and Bottom in A Midsummer Night's Dream, left in 1598 and was replaced by Robert Armin, whose more intellectual and musical talents can be seen in the role of Feste. Shakespeare also collaborated with other writers, especially in the beginning and end of his career. Early collaborators are thought to be Anthony Munday, George Peele, Thomas Nash, Thomas Gid, and Christopher Marlowe. Later collaborators with the now more experienced Shakespeare are George Wilkins, Thomas Middleton, and John Fletcher. These collaborations could take the form of different writers writing separate scenes, or one writer revising an already completed script. For example, the surviving text of Macbeth is a revision done by Middleton. Only half of Shakespeare's plays were published during his lifetime, and a lot of them were unauthorized editions. A good example of these is the garbled first quarto of Hamlet. The seminal Shakespeare publication is the first folio, which was compiled 7 years after his death by John Hemmings and Henry Condell, colleagues from his acting company, The King's Men. In addition to this, there is the work of many generations of editors before we get the Shakespeare text we read today. Even in this simplified form, Shakespeare has a complicated parentage. So why is Shakespeare still important or even interesting to us? Personally, the least interesting Shakespeare is the historical person, as you might gathered. This is not because I do not value such criticism. It is a valid and traditional form of literary criticism. Perhaps I've taken the death of the author too seriously. Nevertheless, my interest is mainly in the works and their global afterlives. Shakespeare is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. Therein lies one important aspect to Shakespeare. Reading Shakespeare is one way of making sense why the world is as it is, especially because the English language is now everywhere. The second reason is that the works, whether on stage, film, or in translation, challenges us. There is something familiar and something alien in them. Part of that is the geographical, cultural, and linguistic distance, but also there's a tension between the past and the present. This is to answer the question from Mais about horoscopes and one-sided love. I don't think the issue is whether Shakespeare believed in these things or merely used them, but rather do those things still speak to us, and do they make sense to us in the form in the form that they appear in Twelfth Night? There are still people who believe in horoscopes, and there's no shortage of one-sided love, which I would call desire, but we'll return to that shortly. This also relates to Russell and Mamoun's question about whether unrequited love is universal or specific to the early modern period. The tension between universalism and historicism is a fruitful one for me, and still very present in Shakespeare criticism. My answer to that is that Shakespeare offers us neither universal wisdom nor just historical curiosities, but elements of both are present. It is the tensions, and in the tensions that Shakespeare presents us, what I find interesting and important. I'll also address Safa's questions about Olivia's aristocratic life. It does represent the Elizabethan way of life for a person of that stature, particularly if we find the critic Leslie Hotson's argument convincing when she argued that Shakespeare wanted to please Queen Elizabeth especially with the character of Olivia. But let's return to the play. What parentage? Twelfth Night, or What You Will, was first published in 1623 in the aforementioned first folio. It was probably written in 1600 or 1601. And to answer Hala's question about the background of Twelfth Night, it's based on the Italian play Gli Ingannati, The Deceived, which was written and performed in 1531 by a literary society called the Intronati in Siena. This was published in 1537 and 1554. There's also Niccolo Secchi's comedy Gli Inganni, The Mistakes, performed in 1547 and published in 1562. These plays share the plot of a girl who becomes the page of a man she loves and is made to woo another lady on his master's behalf, who in turn falls in love with this page, but then marries the girl's twin brother. However, neither play was translated into English, though it's possible that an Italian troupe performed in England. So it is likely that Shakespeare got the story from two English prose narratives that recount this story. Firstly, from Barnaby Rich's of Apollonius and Scylla, published in his works Rich, His Farewell to Military Profession of 1581. And secondly, from Emmanuel Ford's The Loves of Violetta, published in the famous history of Parismus in 1598. Part of the answer to Somaya's question about the play's Italian names lies in the source texts. The other part links to Taqwa and Hajer's question of why the play is set in an imaginary setting. Illyria was the ancient name of the coastal region that was across from Italy, across the Adriatic Sea. In Shakespeare's day, it was a region of city-states controlled by Venice. So setting the plays in this region, which are far away enough to be exotic and enticing, but near enough to be relatable, perhaps added to the audience's imagination and suspension of disbelief. These geographical and temporal distances also allowed to touch even on sensitive issues without incurring the hostility of those in power. What Countryman? Twelfth Night is categorized as a comedy, and it does indeed follow the comic pattern of putting obstacles in front of the protagonist and then resolving to a happy ending with the customary wedding. However, Twelfth Night is the last of Shakespeare's line of romantic comedies. Although he still works with the comic form, they are somewhat different, considered problem comedies, romances, or tragicomedies. The critic Marjorie Garber already sees Twelfth Night as being invaded by the world of romance, as she puts it, with, quote, its signature elements of shipwrecks, the rediscovery of long-lost brothers and sisters, physical marks of recognition, and rebirths from the sea, end quote. Shakespeare experimented with dramatic forms, mixing elements of tragedy and comedy with each other. Neoclassical critics disliked this, but romantics venerated Shakespeare for it. This is also a partial answer to Dr. Majid's question about why Shakespeare uses the same metaphors in comedies and tragedies. Though I have to admit I never really considered metaphors to be inclined to either comedy or tragedy. So there's something for me to think about. To answer Fatima's question about the importance of the comic scenes in Twelfth Night, the importance depends on the scene. For example, the mock duel of Cesario Viola and Sir Andrew Aguecheek in Act 3, Scene 4 shows the absurdity of how masculine posturing and cultural conventions coerce two inept and unwilling people to fight each other. However, there's a more serious issue at stake here about unwilling people being forced to fight a war. Many combatants in the First World War deliberately miss when shooting at their enemies. This also connects to Zainab's question whether Shakespeare wants to convey something real when mixing sad scenes into the comic form. The short answer is yes, but the long answer is rather a counter question about whether our view of reality is a narrative one, where we want to view our lives and the outside world as having comic or tragic elements. Do we identify reality as having a story? So moving on. What name? Haneen asks why does the play have two titles? That is a very good question, and I'm not sure I can give a straightforward answer to this. It is really the only play that has that sort of form in its title. But let's examine the titles so that we can have a bit more insight to the play's identity. The first part, Twelfth Night, is the 12th night after Christmas, the birth of Christ. Barbara Everett explains it well. Quote, "The greatest party of the Christian world of the Renaissance took place on 12th night, the 6th of January, the last evening of the 10-day Christmas period in which Elizabethans exchanged gifts and made merry to celebrate the showing or epiphany of the newborn Christ child to the gift-giving kings and shepherds. Something of this Elizabethan Saturnalian night, ruled over by Festus, the lord of misrule, is reflected in Shakespeare's comedy and in its stress on ordinary human content and good fellowship, cakes and ale, as Sir Toby puts it, in its commendation of generosity of spirit, as in Olivia's to be generous, guiltless, and of free disposition, and in its sense of the wintriness of ordinary human existence, the wind and the rain that impels us to do what the fool calls make a good voyage out of nothing." End quote. In these revels, social roles can be reversed, as anyone partaking in the feast and getting a bean from a certain cake could become the lord of misrule, despite their social rank. This reversal can be seen in many places in the play. For example, Sir Toby turning night into day, or Viola becoming his, or rather her, master's mistress. Moreover, as Marjorie Garber explains, quote, "The word epiphany has a more general modern meaning, denoting a revealing manifestation, a sudden flash of insight, or a sudden recognition of identity." End quote. So play culminates in the epiphany of Viola. However, the title does not define the timing within the play. The action of the play happens over 3 months, as we find out from Orsino in the final scene. 3 months this youth has tended upon me. There are 3 points of time mentioned, but none of them are really determining. Because the timing cannot be identified, the title's relationship to the play's action can be seen as a bit more metaphorical. As the date of 12th night marks the end of festivities and the beginning of the return to ordinary and everyday practices and work. So perhaps we can see the play as a struggle or between the spirit of festivity, aptly named Feste, and the bitterly stern guardian of the economy, Malvolio, whose name is Italian for ill will. This is one way to answer Barra's question in how should we look at Malvolio. Moreover, to answer Abdullalah and Rania, the role of Feste the clown in this type of reading is to bring joy to the ordinary life in Illyria, perhaps to ease some social tensions. C.L. Barber, in his classic study on festival, suggested that the festivities can play a cathartic role. And quote, just as the Saturnalian reversal of social roles need not threaten the social structure, but can serve instead to consolidate it, so a temporary, playful reversal of sexual roles can renew the meaning of the normal relation. End quote. Thus the spirit of Feste permeates the play. As Olivia says to Malvolio, there is no slander in an allowed fool. Let's return to what name. Regarding the or what you will part of the title, Garber suggests that the second half, quote, the second half of the play's title speaks both to this customary season of topsy-turvy revelry and to the space of fantasy and wish fulfillment that was the early modern playhouse. With fantasy and wish fulfillment, Garber hints to the desire I suggested. So why do I talk about desire instead of love? First of all, they're not mutually exclusive. There is an element of desire in love. Second, there are many kinds of love: an erotic, divine, and a social type, just to name three. And of course, these might change in the course of one's life. There is a lot to talk about in the concept of love, but now I really want to focus on the differentiating aspect between love and desire. Whereas love is mutual and reciprocal, in desire there is a negative element, an emptiness that needs to be filled so that there's a constant and incessant outward directedness. This idea of desire, and I've massively simplified it, comes from the 19th century German philosopher G.W.F. Hegel and is developed further in the 20th century by the French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. This desire can be satiated by the mutual recognition of love, but that's a slightly different matter. On a quick note, the theory of love that's most associated with this play, and especially the lines of Antonio I mentioned in the beginning of this lecture, that an apple cleft in two is not more twin than these two creatures, is from Plato's Symposium dialogue, where the figure of Aristophanes describes a time when there were three kinds of human beings: male, female, and androgynous, a mixture of male and female, literally. However, these humans were round in shape, with the back and sides in a circle, 4 hands and legs, 2 faces, 2 sets of sexual organs, and so on. Double everything we have. These were powerful beings, and in order to quell their threat, Zeus cut them in half so that they would spend their life looking for the other half. For the humans who were male, their other half was male too. For the females, it was female. And for the androgynous humans, their other half is the opposite sex that they are. And now, Plato writes, love is the name for their pursuit of wholeness, of their desire to be complete. Returning to the play, as we've noticed, there's very little of that reciprocal mutual love. Mais called it one-sided love, and Russell and Mamoun talked about unrequited love. The difference between love and desire is best seen with Orsino. In Act 2, Scene 4, Orsino describes himself in love. For such as I am, all true lovers are, unstayed and skittish in all motions else, save in the constant image of the creature that is beloved. He is in continuous unrest, and the only thing that is constant is the image of the creature that is beloved. It should be noted that this is in the context of where Orsino is depicting himself to Cesario as a kind of archetype of a lover. It is very telling that Orsino describes the structure of love, but doesn't actually name the beloved. It is like Orsino is describing a picture frame without actually discussing the actual picture. There is the place of the beloved, but it seems empty. This is even clearer in the first scene of the play. Here also lies the question or the answer to Randa's question. Orsino says, "Oh, when mine eyes did see Olivia first, methought she purged the air of pestilence. That instant was I turned into a hart, and my desires, like fell and cruel hounds, e'er since pursue me." As many critics have noted, if we follow the logic of what Orsino is saying, when he first saw Olivia, he began to desire himself. This is also my answer to Warood's question. Orsino does not actually love Olivia. But why is Orsino so fixated on Olivia? It seems that Olivia is the only available option in Orsino's social hierarchy. There are only two women in the play besides Viola, if we look at this coupling heteronormatively. So the dating pool in Illyria is very shallow. This is also an example of the identity thinking I mentioned earlier. Olivia ticks all the boxes in the form that is Orsino's desire, even though he actually desires himself, or desires the idea of himself in love. Farah and Mina ask how Orsino's or how Orsino changed his mind so quickly, and I think this is the reason for it. Viola fits Orsino's structure of desire, and there's a mutual love there. Indeed, I think you could say there was at least an unconscious attraction, be it hetero or homosexual. Moreover, to answer Yusra, I don't think Orsino withdrew from courting Olivia, but chose to actualize his mutual desire with Viola Cesario. But we should remember that when we speak in these modern terms, particularly about early modern plays, many of these ideas didn't really exist in the time of Shakespeare. For example, homosexuality as a concept dates only to the late 19th century, so no one could identify themselves as a homosexual in the early modern period. However, while there was no identity available, the acts were there and practiced. Returning to Orsino and the depictions of his love in response to Voila, Viola Cesario answers Olivia's question on how Orsino loves her. "With adoration's fertile tears, with groans that thunder love, with sighs of fire. Orsino's passive aggressiveness is captured here in tones that are loud but still somewhat generic. Viola Cesario's depiction of Orsino is quite honest. Orsino's stubbornness. In your denial I would find no sense, she said. And the loud relentlessness ring true in Viola Cesario's words. He would halloo your name to reverberate the hills and make the babbling gossip of the air cry out, Olivia! Oh, you should not rest between the elements of air and earth, but you should pity me. Orsino's strategy looks to be wearing out Olivia and just willing her into submission. Viola Cesario alone looks to have spent just 3 months between Act 1, Scene 5 and Act 3, Scene 4 as Orsino's spokesperson. So who knows how long has this been going on? Much noise, but little actual love. Viola Cesario does not critique Orsino's view of love, especially about women's love, while at the same time hinting at her desire for Orsino. This is at the end of Act 2, Scene 4. So you've heard me speak more than enough, so let's look at some professionals doing this.
My father had a daughter, loved a man, as it might be, perhaps. Were I a woman, I should your lordship.
What's her history?
A blank, my lord. She never told her love. But let concealment like a worm i' the bud feed on her damask cheek. She pined in thought, and with a green and yellow melancholy she sat like patience on a monument, smiling at grief. Was not this love indeed? We men may say more, swear more, but our shows are more than will, for still we prove much in our vows, but little in our love.
But died thy sister of her love, my boy?
I am all the daughters of my father's house, and all the brothers too, and yet I know not.
Here you can see how Viola Cesario critiques the masculine tendencies of domineering, superfluous speech, of putting on a show. A lot of noise, but a lack of substance. In addition, you can see how unsure Viola Cesario is of her identity and future. Were I a woman, being all the daughters and the brothers too, yet I know not. Although Viola emphasizes silence, her description of love has a lot in common with Orsino. A melancholy suffering over time, idealized into a monument. Importantly, Viola defines love and her identity as a lack, a blank, an emptiness to be filled akin to Orsino's picture frame description. This is more desire than it is love. Identity and desire coincide. What are you? What would you? In Olivia and Cesario Viola's exchanges, desire and identity are once more intertwined. Olivia asks, I prithee tell me what thou thinkst of me. That you do think you are not what you are. If that is so, I think the same of you. Then you are right, I am not what I am. I would you were as I would have you be. Would it be better, madam, than I am? I wish it might, for now I am your fool. Identity thinking is at the fore here. When Viola Cesario tells Olivia that she thinks she is not what she is, It is chastising her for not playing her part in becoming Orsino's wife. She is unwilling to be put into that category. Yet, Olivia does the same thing, trying to make Viola fit the identity she desires Cesario to be, a husband. I would you were as I would have you be. Viola, too, is unwilling to slot into the category allotted to her. She is very aware of identity, even wary of it. Here she explicitly says she is not who she is. You will remember when Viola Cesario first met Olivia, when they are constantly trying to verify Olivia's identity as the lady of the house. Cesario Viola fully admits, I am not that I play. This negativity inside Viola of not being who she is or what she plays is perhaps not just about her disguise or her desire. It's not just about her disguise or her desire for Orsino, but also a desire to find her identity, her place in the world, in a foreign country, bereft of her twin. This is where Tagrid's question on how love can be so sudden and irresistible, this is where that comes in. The desire fueled search for love coincides with the slipperiness of identity. So in the play, many characters have hidden structures of desire they may not be aware of until they are faced with the possibility to actualize it. This is what you get with Macbeth and his black and deep desires. This also explains why Malvolio, as Ruba asks, suddenly changes from a stern steward to prancing around in yellow cross-carded stockings, besides being a satire of a serious economist, or someone who takes themselves too seriously. Just before he sees the planted letter, Malvolio shows his desire to be Count Malvolio. Marrying Olivia would merely be a means to his end. In another example of identity thinking, Malvolio projects his own desires onto the letter and, perhaps like a literary critic, starts to see himself in it. This is confirmation bias at work. He sees Malvolio in MOAI and Olivia's handwriting in her C's, U's and T's and the capital P. Of course, as many critics have noted, there's not a C or a capital P in the part of the letter that Malvolio read when saying that. The wish fulfillment is underlined in the letter's suggestion that thou art made if thou desires to be so. What are you? What would you? To answer Harith and Ithar, Shakespeare uses the letter because, as Sir Toby smells, it is an excellent dramatic device. On one hand, it can be a vehicle for misidentification, like here, or on the other hand, it can be used to represent someone on stage without actually them being there, as this can be used for comic purposes in the end of the play, with first representing Malvolio's grievances in a letter, then building up to the spectacle of the disheveled Malvolio finally appearing on the stage in full sight. The letter is a very adaptable device. Here also lies one answer to Ruba's question about the significance of minor characters. It is mainly the characters of Maria and Fabian that actualize the use of the letter device in the mistreatment of Malvolio. However, it should be said it depends on what we determine as minor. For example, in terms of the plot, Sir Toby is a secondary character. But in terms of lines, speeches, and stage presence, Sir Toby is the largest role in the whole play. Furthermore, while still in the proximity of Malvolio, to answer Rasha and Seal, the play's class conflict can be best seen in the character of Malvolio, because he is a social climber and presents the biggest challenge to the class hierarchy, as can be seen in his desires and the plot against him, particularly Sir Toby being against him. So moving on to Sama's question, we can most definitely read Twelfth Night as a gender study. On one hand, there is the telling necessity of Viola taking on the guise of Cesario. And this is also a response to the questions from Saif and Noor. In the source text from Barnaby Rich, the main heroine's journey starts on board the ship, where she's threatened with rape, but is saved by the storm. She takes on the male disguise to protect herself from further assaults. Remnants of this type of threat linger in Shakespeare's play, in Orsino's unwillingness to take no for an answer from Olivia, and in the first scene with Sir Andrew, where Sir Toby urges him to accost Maria, to board her, woo her, assail her. Adding to the excuse me, I'm sorry, drink. Ooh. Adding to this, the critic Jean E. Howard suggests that Olivia is made to fall in love with the cross-dressed Viola in order to humiliate her for threatening the hierarchical gender order. So Olivia is punished for her unruliness. However, on the other hand, women play the active roles in Twelfth Night. Viola with her energy, Olivia woos Cesario and weds Sebastian. Maria comes up with a plan to fool Malvolio. In contrast, all of Olivia's male suitors are passive. Orsino stays away and sends a messenger. Sir Andrew mirrors others around him. Malvolio does what he thinks Olivia wants of him. I think Olivia is one of the strongest female characters in Shakespeare. Responding to Dr. Majid's question, Olivia is more independent than Gertrude or Ophelia, or even Lady Macbeth, who works in tandem with and partially through her husband. But regarding Zainab's question, I think almost every character in the play, like Olivia, has a weak moment when they're fooled. Though perhaps Maria is the one who is relatively scathed. One of the strengths of Shakespeare's work is that most of his characters have a human-like depth with strengths and weaknesses, which is why we have the tendency to treat them as if they were real. It is very much part of his style. Moving on to Antonio and Sebastian's relationship and Abu Bakr's question about it. I think this is the hardest relationship to figure out in Twelfth Night. It has thematic similarities with other relationships, as Antonio's desire did spur him to follow Sebastian into hostile territory. But unlike others, their relationship seems quite balanced, equal and reciprocal. Being united with Antonio in the final scene, Sebastian exclaims that Hours have racked and tortured him since he lost Antonio. However, after those lines, Antonio is lost again. We don't have any definite knowledge of what happens to him in the end of the play. Antonio and Sebastian's relationship could be interpreted in many ways. It can be homosexual, or depending on who plays the role, of course, or a deep friendship, or even both. Moreover, Sebastian need not necessarily choose between Olivia and Antonio, as it was not unheard of in the early modern period that married men, or was not heard of for married men to have male lovers, especially in the higher echelons of society. To briefly answer Mahmoud's question about the exploration of gender and sexuality, yes, there is more to analyze in Twelfth Night than in As You Like It. And I think the open ending of the play adds to the depth of the exploration, because it does not really leave you with any simple answers. Tabark wonders why Antonio would risk his life to help Sebastian and then be seemingly left with nothing. For me, this is linked to Laith's question about how we can trust other people, especially in the modern world. These are quite very difficult questions, but I think the answer comes in the form of, or the answer is love, in the very broadest sense. Antonio clearly deeply cares for Sebastian, and in that relationship, gain does not really register high on the scale of importance. In trusting other people, we open ourselves to injury, yet a negative outcome is not guaranteed, as with Viola's trust of the sea captain in Act 1, Scene 2. The word charity encapsulates the trusting kind of love, with its Christian roots in the Latin caritas, meaning the Christ-like conduct of loving fellow human beings. This utopian ideal is suggested by Olivia. Love sought is good, but given unsought is better. Returning to Wala's question, I think this is the most profound depiction of not just romantic, but any type of love in the play. It challenges the one-way traffic of mere desire. Relatedly, and to answer Muhammad's question about the religious connotations of these love triads, the critic Paul Dean argues that Viola, Cesario, and Sebastian form the Christian Trinity in this play. That this analysis is based on the Christian philosopher St. Augustine's defense of the doctrine of Trinity, the three in one, where love forms the triad of the lover, the beloved, and the love which each has for each other. This idea perhaps could be applied to Olivia, Orsino, and Cesario in that order. Finally, to answer Jinan's question about the political message of Twelfth Night, the play perhaps most challenges the politics of gender and sexuality, especially through love. As desire linked with identity thinking wants to make the object of love conform to our desire and its categorizing place, which thus validating the identity provided by that desire, a fuller reciprocal sense of love denies such restrictions placed on it. Viola and Olivia's refusal to be identified as the object of Olivia and Orsino's love. Moreover, Antonio and Sebastian's uncategorized mutual love resist identity thinking's need to put a label on it. There is a political radicalness in being a lover who gives unsought, especially in a world that seeks to make us conform to our allotted role. Love, given unsought, promises to depower the "what are you? What would you?" urges. Thank you for your time. If you have any questions, Dr. Majid has my contact details and I'm happy to answer any queries. My love to you all and keep safe.